Welcome to Spaces Between, a podcast about bringing gamers closer together. Today I have a very special guest, Jamie Keagy from the Secret Cabal. What's going on, man?
Hey now, how's it going over there? Doing just fine over here.
That's awesome, man. But yeah, I'm super excited to have you on the show. I've actually been listening to your podcast for like a really long time, and I know the Secret Cabal is part of the Dice Tower Network, and you guys have been doing stuff for forever and all sorts of exciting things. So if anybody doesn't know who you are from the Dice Tower, which they should, what kind of do you do as far as board game media goes?
Well, we started off in 2011. About 8.5 years ago, and started doing a podcast, a long-form podcast. And for the most part, we talk about tabletop games. We started off talking about board games and role-playing games, and got into miniatures games. And since we've sort of spread out all of that content, doing a separate role-playing game show, and kept most of the board gaming stuff in our main show, the Secret Cabal. And mostly we kind of, I would say, focus on it being more of an entertainment show, with board games being sort of the overall sort of joining topic that we bring together there. And that's what we try to do. We try to make an entertaining show that helps you get through your day, so to speak. Because that's kind of how, when we started it, what I really wanted to do was emulate the things that I listened to while I was sitting at an office all day long and just wanted to stick my headphones in, put my head down and work and listen. And that's why we do the long form show. So, you can listen to us pretty much all afternoon.
That's one of the things that I've loved is like the fact that you guys do so much banter and really like show off the personalities on your show. It's not just like just information in your face. It's like, no, we're here to have fun. We're here to goof off. We're here to act kind of crazy. So it makes it really fun to listen to.
Yeah, and that is also part of what we wanted to bring to the show, is we wanted to sort of emulate what it was like friends sitting around talking about the hobby that they love. And that's really how we started, was, a couple of the hosts, Brian and I specifically, used to sit at a diner and we would talk about Dungeons and Dragons for hours at a time, bottomless cup of coffee being refilled constantly. And we would just sit and talk about games and what we loved about games. We would pick apart games. We would do reviews of games just sitting there across the table from each other. And we got to a point where I started listening to different podcasts. I started mostly listening to the D6 Generation, and I listened to a role-playing podcast called Fear the Boot. And both of them had this camaraderie of friendship, that these guys got together and they were hanging out as friends doing a podcast together. And it sounded like they were sitting in a game room talking to each other about the game they just played. And that's what we wanted to sort of bring to our podcast, and make it feel like not only were we sitting around the table talking about it, but you as the listener were sort of there with us, listening and hanging out with us, having this conversation. And that I hope we've achieved that at this point, but that's sort of our focus.
I always think it's crazy how, like, when you're listening to a podcast and you've listened to it for so long, you start to feel like you know those people and stuff like that. It's like, oh my goodness, like, oh yeah, you get to know like their inside jokes and all the different things around. I mean, I did a podcast for a while, and it always meant so much when someone would come up and like share an inside joke. It's like you know these people already, or they already know you just don't know them yet, And
it's funny you say that, because I almost feel like at this point, after doing it for so long, and having those inside jokes and having those sort of shared experiences that the listeners bring, we talk about stuff and they hear it and they talk about it, and we share this stuff on our forums and stuff. Yes, they come up to us and they talk to us like they've known us for years. And
in some ways they have, right?
Yeah. But it's so weird that at first we felt like, wow, it's so odd that these people think they know us. But it's gotten to the point now where I almost feel like I know them. Because they come up and they just get into a conversation as though we're old friends. And I just kind of like click right in there and just keep going with the conversation. Like I've met this person years ago and we're just meeting again after a couple of years of not seeing each other. It feels that way now. It's really a wonderful thing doing these podcasts and getting to know the people that enjoy listening to your show.
I know you guys have had like some crazy meetups. I've been to several different ones, but I don't know. It's always been fun, like seeing like how big some of those have gotten sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Well, that is true. Yes, we started doing them at Gen Con Well, maybe it was like 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago is when we first started doing them, and at Origins too. And they started off so really small, 15, 20 people at first. And we got to a point where at Gen Con 3 years ago, we had 1,200 people at the brewery. The brewery shut themselves down so that we could bring all of our people in. We had 1,200 people there. And
bathrooms
I'll tell you,
overflowing.
Bathrooms got broken, and yes, they shut down a bathroom. And so, yeah, it was a ton of people. But I'll tell you, as much as I'm proud of the fact that we could do that, like that was something that could happen due to us just creating this event, it's too much, man. It is just too much. I'm happy that it happened because I feel good about it. But it really wasn't the experience that the attendees would like, right? You know, when it's a meetup, you want to come and meet each other and talk to, you know, the hosts. You want to meet other Cabalists and things that are there to hang out. So, yes, we scaled back significantly since then on purpose. We were like, you know what? We want it back to like the 200, you know, so we can get around and talk to every single person that comes that night. So, yes, last year at Gen Con, we had about 200 people, and it was the perfect size. Very cool party.
I think you can never surpass the burlap sack moment, you know. You're always chasing after that moment of burlap sack.
It's funny. I just put a video up on YouTube just last week or 2 weeks ago where I feature the burlap sack. Knockdown Barns is the actual name of the game. And I'm so happy that I got a copy. And anybody who's watching it doesn't know what we're talking about. We have our meetup at Gen Con. We always do a raffle. You know, we have a big table of games, just all these different publishers. They're happy to give us games so that we can give them out to our listeners. So we have this giant table. And I was at our meetup, and this guy comes walking up to me. Just like a regular guy, you know. And he says, you know, I'm a designer, and I designed this game called Knockdown Barns. And I would like to give you a copy to put into your raffle. And I was like, sure, I would love to have it. Why not? Yeah. And he turns around, and he hands me a giant burlap sack. And I was like...
And you're like, what in the world could be in this thing?
Yeah. I was like, okay, thank you. And I took it, and I went over and I just put it on the table with the other games. I put it in a pile somewhere. Didn't look inside. Didn't know what was in there. So we started having the raffle, you know, and I'm on the microphone, and I'm calling numbers for the raffle and whatnot. And I start making some jokes about when people are coming up to pick the games that they want when they won the raffle. I kept pointing at it and saying, like, there's a burlap sack right there. I'm told there's a game in it, but I don't know what you're going to find if you open it. And at this point, people just start going crazy. Every time somebody would come up, the whole crowd wanted somebody to pick up the burlap sack, to take that. And so people started chanting, burlap sack, burlap. And finally somebody did, and the whole place went nuts. And I got to tell you, that is a memory of mine that makes it feel so great. And I'm so happy that I actually got a copy of the game myself as a memento from that moment. And weirdly enough, it's a really fun game anyway.
Yeah, like a dexterity game of flicking little foam marshmallows trying to knock down pieces of wood that were actually made out of old barns, right?
Yep, reclaimed wood from old barns. You just build a castle and try to destroy the other player's castle. It's really fun, actually. Yeah, that's a weird
awesome one. So you started doing the Secret Cabal with your friends. How did it start to become like a part of the Dice Tower Network, or how did things look like when you guys first started podcasting?
Oh, well, I'll tell you, first off, we started off and things were going okay. You know, we were getting listeners, you know, release after release. And at some point along the way, Stephen Bonacore from Stronghold Games, he started listening to our show really early on, probably like episode 2 or something. He started listening to our show, and we reviewed one of his games, Panic Station, and we didn't like it. We reviewed it negatively, so he emails us to complain, but you know, jokingly complain. And in that same email, he was like, you know what, I love you guys. You guys are great. You know, I don't care that you didn't like this game, whatever. You guys are honest. But, you know, he saw something in us for some reason. He said, you guys got something, and I want to be part of it. And he's became our sponsor at that point. He's still our sponsor to today. So it's like 7 years later, or it's 8 years later, he's still the sponsor of our show because he believed in us from the beginning, and we love Steven, and we love Steven's games for the most part. Maybe not Panic Station, but whatever. Anyway, and that sort of like helped us out a little, start to get a little bit more momentum and things going. And then, of course, we joined the Dice Tower Network, and that's when things just kind of like springboarded from there. Like Tom was super gracious to have us on the network early on like that, because I guess Tom listened to us as well and enjoyed the show. And from what I understand, Tom still listens to the show. I think he emails me every now and then to complain about something we said. But that was really the big springboard when we joined the network, because we were exposed to a very large audience at that point, and people started checking us out because of that. And since then it's just up and up, and I'm very proud of what we've managed to do with the show over the past 8.5 years. And to this day, it's still a pleasure to do the show. It's so much fun. It's every day I sit down to work on the podcast or do a video or something, and it's just it's really a pleasure to do that. I mean, it's more fun than it is work ever. So I just love it. Yeah,
and you did it just for fun for like a long time, right?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, our first fundraiser was in 2017, and that's when we first decided to actually try and do more with the show than we had done before. At that point, I was doing the Secret Cabal and the Secret Cabal Express, which is the shorter version of the show that we do, once a month. And at that point, it was like getting to the point where I was spending so much time outside of my regular day job to just work on the show constantly. And I really wanted to start doing some video work. And it just was impossible to do more. So we were like, you know what, let's give it a shot and try doing this Kickstarter thing. And it succeeded. And I'm still doing it here, 3 years later, going into the next Kickstarter, hoping that I can continue doing it for another year. And I feel, I don't know even the word to say. I feel wonderful that I have the privilege to be able to do this as my job and be able to create this stuff that just makes people happy. So before that, I don't know, what was it, like 6 years or something that we were doing it. We had sponsors, but, that wasn't, we weren't making tons of money or anything. Really, that just helped us get to conventions.
For
sort
sure.
of a little perk for doing the show. Oh, boy, we get to go to a convention here and there.
And paying for all the hosting fees for the podcast and everything like that. So, that's awesome. It's crazy. There's so many people out there that want to do board game media and stuff, but I think sometimes people don't realize like how much work a lot of the people that have done it for a long time put in just for fun. It's like, I did this for fun for 6 years. I did this for fun for like 10 years, know.
I mean, even now like, it's still for fun.
Right.
I mean, yes, I'm getting paid a salary to do it, but that's just so that I have the time to be able to put the amount of effort I want to into it. And I'm a graphic designer. I was a web designer, and I did video production for years. I worked 17 years at a company where I did that kind of work, mostly graphic design and web design. And before that, I was in a band for years. So I was a musician, and I was in a punk rock band. And for about 5 years, we went the bar scene around the local Pennsylvania area here. And so I was always like a creative person. Like I love to create things. So this was just the perfect thing for me to do, was to be able to create something for myself. Because when you work at a company like that, where you're designing a website, you got a client coming in that's like, I'm a guy who sells outboard motors, and I need a website. And I'm like, great, that's my duty for the next month. I'm going to design this outboard motors website. And I'm like, really don't want to design a website for outboard motors, but that's my job. So it's a pleasure to be able to do something for myself that's a creative outlet. And the fact that, I sort of dictate what happens. There's so many different things that I can do. I can do a video review this week, or a list, my top 5 this games list, or create a cool discussion segment. Judge Topper, where Tony Topper gets to decide whether this is the right or this is right, and just to come up with a fun and an entertaining way to do this stuff. I love it. I love it. It's fun every day.
That's awesome. You've been doing like board game media for such a long time. What would you say is like your favorite part of the show? There's all sorts of different segments. Like, what's the favorite part to do, would you think?
That's really strange because it always changes around. If you would have asked me like a year or two ago, I would have said the news. When Tony Topper does the news and the news segment in the middle of the show.
Or more like making fun of Tony Topper's news.
Yeah, sometimes.
Get this out of my face.
You know, he brings up, different news stories and we just banter around about them. And I just find that pleasurable. And first off, the rest of us do not prepare at all for that segment. We show up and Tony presents a news item and we just react however we react in the moment. And I used to love that. I still do. I still love doing that segment. That would have been my favorite maybe a year ago. But recently we added a new host to the show, Don. And Don, I think, has brought in quite a bit to the show as far as thoughtful commentary about games.
For sure.
I think maybe we had that before to some extent, but Don really brought a lot more of that to the show. And honestly, right now, my favorite segments are the discussion segments where we just sit and talk about, a topic that's brought up. And talking with Don and Chris jumping in and Tony with his wisdom and, Brian always has something thoughtful to say and Steve's always injecting some kind of ridiculous joke. It's just the dynamic works really well and it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like we're talking about something exciting. And when we do short topics, where we just like listener submitted questions, some of them are absolutely ridiculous. Like, what's your favorite Godzilla monster? And Steve and I get to talk for 10 minutes about what our favorite Godzilla monster is. Has nothing to do with gaming at all. But it's just fun that those things can happen in that segment. And I just have such a blast doing it. And it's a great way to end the show. When we're doing a long recording and we're like in our 3.5 hours at this point of sitting and recording the show. And finally we get to this part where we could just let loose and goof off and talk about something fun. It really adds a nice punch to the end of the day. I have such a fun time doing that.
I think it's cool that you guys have you started off as like the friends making a podcast and the camaraderie really shows, but you guys have such diverse taste in games as well. Everybody likes different things, so it makes it kind of interesting. Like, oh, this person likes these games, this person's like, oh, that's too dry for me, or oh, I need more theme, or oh, I want it to be more puzzly. It's very interesting to hear everybody's different takes on them.
It makes our game nights very interesting, too, because it's hard to find the right game to play. Because Steve doesn't want to play Agricola and grow vegetables. He finds that exceedingly boring.
I agree with
Chris
Steve.
really gets excited about that kind of stuff. And it's, for me personally, I fall straight down in the middle. I'll go to the driest of dry Euros. If it's a well-designed game, I'm all in. And I'll go to the complete other side and have Funko Pop characters running around attacking each other and have a blast playing that. Whether it's a good game or not, I'll have a blast playing it. I just enjoy playing games. Any game. Like, I'll play Arkwright and I'll put together that spreadsheet. I don't care. But then I'll also go over here and play with the Funko Pops and have a great time. It's just sitting across the table from people and laughing and talking, having conversation, having a few beers together, and then playing a great game. It's all that matters to me, man. I'll play anything. You bring it to me, I'll play it. Except Panic Station.
And then you have the whole other side where you have a whole different podcast where you talk about role-playing games and D&D. Yes. And then you also talk a lot about miniatures games and Warhammer and stuff as well. Oh,
yeah. And I'll be honest with you. When we first started doing the Secret Cabal, back in 2011, for about half the run of the show was pretty much like a third role-playing game. We had a role-playing discussion pretty much every episode. So we ran the gamut of all different types of games that we talked about. And we split that off into the other show. Since the game that got me into gaming, we were just having a conversation. Joel Eddy and I were having a conversation just the other day about, what games got you into things. Because we just talked about on one of our recent episodes about backgammon. And Tony was talking about how he was playing backgammon. He had never played backgammon before. And Joel was saying how, that's the way I got into gaming was I played backgammon with my grandfather or somebody. and backgammon and cards, like trick-taking games or whatever, older game, checkers, chess, that's what started him in it. Didn't start me with that. Like, I didn't start with that kind of stuff. My family really didn't play any games. Pictionary was like the game that our family played, and that really didn't get me into gaming. It was just a thing it did, right?
But it got you into graphic design. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I didn't really have that experience. What got me into gaming was Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons was, I remember the day that I went over to Steve's house, because Steve and I have been friends since we were about 12 years old. I went over to Steve's house one day, and he says, hey, my neighbor showed me this game, Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I heard of Dungeons and Dragons before, of course. I watched the cartoon when I was a kid, that kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, let's give it a shot. So we started playing, and I was floored. I was astounded that this thing existed. There was a thing like this. I had no idea this was what it was like. And we probably played it all wrong. The adventure was probably horrible. I know what adventure it was, but I don't remember what happened in it. But something about it just hooked me, and that's what got me into gaming. And we would play, and I'll tell you, I don't think there has been more than a 3-month period gone by since that year. It was 1992, something like that, crazy. That I haven't been in some sort of role-playing campaign with a group of people. And to this day, it's still my absolute favorite gaming activity. I love board games. I love Warhammer. I love Gaslands. I love all the miniatures games, too. I even love Magic the Gathering and the Fantasy Flight's LCGs and that kind of stuff. I love those, too. D&D, that's my jam. That's what I'm excited for every week.
I think as a creative person, it's such a creative outlet as well, Oh, yeah. I grew up playing Gamma World, which was like post-apocalyptic D&D. My dad taught us how to play that, and I can actually remember what we did in our first scenario. Yeah. Still to the day, just because it's just so memorable. It's just role-playing games create these interesting experiences that allow you to interact with a game a way that other games don't really allow you to interact, It's just kind of like most games have these rules that are so strict. In this game, it's like, oh, I want to climb that wall over there. Let me make a roll to make it happen, Yeah. You normally can't do that sort of thing in a board game. And I think it's crazy. The main reason I switched over from role-playing games, and then I got into Magic the Gathering, and then I got into board games, was mostly just because time constraints, You're an adult, you got a mortgage, you have kids. It's like, oh my goodness, when am I going to play a role-playing game for all these hours? And it's just hard to get the groups back together. So it's awesome when people are able to make that happen, but then it's crazy to see how huge it's become,
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. I mean, because, my particular gaming group, none of us have kids. I mean, we're all in our mid-40s, right? And none of us have kids yet or won't have kids. So that hasn't factored into our lives, but it very well could. And really, at this point, when you look at the statistics of people playing role-playing games, there are so many people playing on Roll20, online role-playing games, Fantasy Grounds, that kind of stuff. And really, that's the way people are playing these days, particularly people our age, right, who have children, who have, they have to get up for work the next day. They don't have all day Saturday or all day Sunday to dedicate to this kind of thing. And so technology has really been a huge boon to the role-playing world, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, people are playing that, I'll play for 2 hours a couple times a week. You can find that kind of time, and man, that technology is taking gaming from, trolls in the basement like I used to be when I was a kid to the mainstream because of all of this exposure it's getting and the technology that you can play it whenever you want to at this point.
It's crazy that people are professionally playing D&D on Twitch, basically. It's it's my job to play D&D. And I mean, most of them are famous voice actors and things like that.
Sure, yeah.
But just the fact that it's exploded from that sort of thing. I was at Walmart last night, and I saw a pack of polyhedral dice. They were selling a 3-pack of D&D dice, like Quest dice. And I'm like, they have D&D dice at Walmart now?
Yes, they do. It is huge, man. And it's crazy when you talk about like what you're talking about, the media creators. I mean, we, do essentially gaming for our living as well at this point.
Right.
We're creating media about it. We don't do myself, when we do our role-playing show, we don't do like a live play. We just talk about the games. We talk about writing adventures and playing different kinds of characters and things. But I'm telling you, this world of people exploding into, doing all of this, live plays like Critical Role. I mean, holy cow. People are going – Wendy's, they have a deal with Wendy's that Wendy's creates a role-playing game and they play it on their show. And there's a version of Munchkin coming out based on the Critical Role series. Man, it's a cool world we live in where that can be a thing.
It's like just like a decade ago, it was just like, oh, you play D&D, ha ha ha. It's just It's so funny how the tables have turned at this point because Magic and stuff and D&D and stuff like that was always thought of as like the lowest thing that you don't talk about. But now it's like everybody's like, yeah, Dungeons and Dragons. Like I saw that on Stranger Things. That's awesome. It's really cool how the tables have turned.
I remember those days of where like people would ask you, what's your hobby? What do you get into? And I'd be like, and I try to figure out a way to talk about something other than Dungeons and Dragons. That today, like, I'll go in and get my hair cut, and they're like, what do you do for a living? Well, I make videos and podcasts about board games. They're like, oh.
That's awesome. And it's cool that, like, there's not a whole lot of people that get to do board game media, like, as professionally. I mean, we're some of the few people. I mean, I mostly edit videos, but I make all sorts of videos as well. But it's really cool, like, how big the hobby has grown and how much there's a demand for all this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everybody's always talking about like, oh man, there's going to be a board game bubble that's going to burst. But the fact that like the beginning of this year, there were multiple like Dark Tower, Oath, and Foundations of Rome were all like over $1 million at the same time. Like it's kind of crazy.
It's an interesting concept.
How people are excited.
Like the bubble bursting thing. Of course, like, I don't think there is a bubble to burst at this point because I don't think even board games have hit what they could hit. Look at Dungeons and Dragons at this point. You're talking critical role and, there's, famous people, talking about how they play role-playing games and all this different stuff. And there are some famous people that talk about the board games that they play too. But we really haven't gotten to that point in the board game world where we have so much – there's so much more room to grow in the community. But then there's always this conversation about too many games coming out and all that kind of thing. And maybe that's part of it. I think the industry just needs to write itself to a certain way to find that niche where it can skyrocket even higher.
Yeah, I really wonder what the catalyst for sharing games. Like when I used to work in retail, like I'd play board games during lunch break, and I ended up getting a gaming group out of that sort of thing, slowly teaching people to play Love Letter, and then teach them to play this other game, and then teach them to play, and then they come over to my house and we play Betrayal at House on the Hill, and just playing more and more games. And I think just people out there want to game and want to have this social interaction. It's just, I think there's a lot of people out there that don't know it exists, and as geek culture is becoming more acceptable, I feel like more people are jumping on board.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that Dungeons and Dragons existed for so long, I mean, of course, board games existed for a long time too, but I mean, this one particular product existed for so long, and everybody knew about it through the 80s. And then, of course, there was the whole satanic panic concept in the 80s, and people thought it was like an evil game, and people thought that it was turning kids crazy, and they were getting themselves lost in the bowels of the college, and private investigators were searching for them, all this different stuff. And so it was in the news, right? Like, and people were on like Maury Povich and I think because it had such a presence and people knew about it for so long that now it's not something that's difficult to sort of fathom what it is, right?
Gotcha. Yeah,
and I think board games never really got that. Catan is like the closest thing that anyone's ever gotten there, where you say Settlers of Catan, there are still people that don't know what that means, but the people are like, oh yeah, that's that board game. But for the most part, board games don't have that one entity to look to, and so like you said, they don't exactly know that it exists exactly. So it's kind of hard for somebody to get into something they don't know about. So it's got to be word of mouth. There aren't commercials on Hulu while you're watching some episode that comes on and talks about board games, so you got to know somebody to be able to get into the games, and then you have to be willing to sit and learn and listen to the rules and learn how to play, which is very daunting.
We were on the plane flying to Dice Tower West, and the guy that was sitting next to me asked me what I did for a living, random conversation. I'm like, oh yeah, I edit YouTube videos and do YouTube videos for a board game review channel. He's like, and I knew it was coming. He's like, so board games like Monopoly? And I'm like, I mean, kind of, but not exactly. And I went through the whole thing of talking about all sorts of different hobby games and all that stuff. And he was interested. He said his son plays a bunch of different games and things like that, and watches people play games on Twitch and things like that. But it's just interesting, like, most people, when you say, oh, I play board games, a lot of times it still comes back to that, what, like Monopoly?
Yeah. It's so crazy how that is still the thing. Even when there's Magic the Gathering is out there. Because Magic the Gathering is very close to what we do, right? I mean, it seems to have its own, its own culture and its own sort of it's like its own hobby. Like there's the D&D the role-playing hobby, then there's the Magic the Gathering hobby, then there's the board game hobby, and then there's the miniatures game hobby. It's only one of those actually is the game itself, Magic the Gathering. But it's so similar to what we do. I mean, with Marvel Champions and all these games that are very similar to that, and a lot of board games that are like that too. It almost feels like more people would know to go to that than Monopoly. Oh, like Magic the Gathering? That would make sense to me. But it doesn't seem to happen that way.
I remember at Target, I was playing Magic with one of my coworkers, and the store manager came up and was like, what are you guys playing, Dungeons and Dragons? I'm like, no, this is Magic. Dungeons and Dragons is on Wednesday night, man. You want to come? Like...
Yeah, man, I used to play Magic back in the day, too. I still love Magic to this day. I don't play anymore because, really, I don't have anybody to play with. That's actually the reason. But
I can't afford to play Magic.
Yeah, well, it's so much easier today than it used to be. You don't have to pour the money into booster packs like you used to, right? You can get the dual decks or the pre-con decks and maybe some extra cards to shuffle in and out. And now they got this new concept where they're kind of going with the Keyforge concept, where you buy a theme deck and you get the wolves or the soldiers or whatever, and then you can customize it a little bit, but it's your own custom deck that you bought. So it's a lot easier than it used to be. But still to this day, I think Magic the Gathering is one of the greatest card games ever designed.
Oh, for sure.
When I play that thing, I'm just like, this thing is perfectly elegant. And it's so complicated. I mean, as far as complicated, it's got so many rules, so many different powers over all of those different series that came out. But they pare it down. Each series that comes out only has a couple of them in it. So picking up this series and playing it is so simple, and it's just so deep with strategy. Man, it's one of the best games ever designed. Richard Garfield, man, he's a genius.
Oh, for sure. It's crazy that there's so many formats in Magic. If you ask someone if they play Magic the Gathering, it should then almost be followed up but what way? How? Because there's EDH where it's 100-card decks, and then there's a lot of people that only play limited and draft and go to pre-releases. Sure. There's people that play cube and draft that, there's so many different formats. It's are you playing old school Legacy, or are you playing in Standard? And it's crazy how many branching forms of Magic there are within that game. There's a whole subculture inside of Magic that it's I only play this type. It's kind of crazy.
It's funny because I whatever version of what you just said, my version is whatever cards I got, I'm gonna put it together and play that deck. So I might have cards from back in Ice Age and play with ones that came out 2 years ago and jam them together, and there's the deck I got.
It's always fun to play Magic super casually and play with a dual deck or play with some random cards. It's just when the one friend is you know what? I'm going to go buy a few more cards. And then you're gotta ruin it for everybody. Ruin it for everybody.
Yeah. And I always try to get I always fool myself with these LCGs, CCGs, and stuff like that.
Oh, for sure.
You know, I always fool myself. I think, like, this is the one. This is the one I'm going to get into, and everybody's going to be fired up about it. And, you know, 2 years ago at Gen Con, they came out with the Warhammer Champions, I think it was called. Yeah. And Age of Sigmar Champions is what it was. Awesome game. I love this game. It was great. I bought all of the starter decks. They all came with some booster packs and stuff too. And, you know, I bought some extra stuff, and I bought the play mats. I'm like, you know, Tony and I were both into it, and all of Gen Con we played that game, and it was great. And I was like, oh, and there's an app that you scan your cards and they go into the app. So your decks are in your app, so I can play with Tony across the country. This is going to be great. This is my new game. And I didn't play it at all as soon as I got home. I fool myself every time. Marvel Champions comes out. I'm buying, like, every deck. And, like, I can't find anybody that wants to play it with me. So I'm like, I fooled myself again. I want to play it, but nobody wants to play it with me.
I really enjoyed the co-op, like, LCGs. Because, like, with a lot of these, like, collectible card games, there's, like, a whole meta, and you have to keep up with the current stuff. Because if you play somebody who has more cards than you, they're just going to crush you because they know the game more. But if you're playing a cooperative game, it's not nearly as high stakes, or you don't have to care about it as much. It's like, oh, I can just buy packs as I want more packs to play. I've actually played Marvel Champions a lot solo as well.
Yeah.
So
I've done a lot of solo with Marvel Champions as well. And I really enjoy that one because that one is so... It has deck building in it. You can customize the deck, but it's so simple if you just want to play. Like, you don't have to think hard. You're like, okay, I'm going to play Captain America with the leadership deck and put it together, and you got a deck. I love that concept. And if I want to tweak from there, I can tweak from there, but not everybody wants to do that. I'm telling you, this is one of the best LCGs they've put out. They've done a really good job with this one.
I think it's really cool, too, that every single hero they give you comes with a pre-built deck already. So if you don't want to deck build, you technically never have to. You can just get the pre-built deck, play with whatever it is, and get the next pre-built deck and play with whatever it is. I'm sure eventually you'll get to a boss that might be hard to defeat if you don't, like, tweak your deck specifically to beat them. But if you're playing on the easier difficulties, it's not that hard to do, and it's still fun to play together with other people.
Yeah. That's a good one. And I have bought everything up to this point.
And it's so hard to find,
for that moment where I'm going to stop buying. There's always a moment where I'm like, you know what? I got to stop because I'm buying more than I can actually use.
I know some of your other friends are in that, too. I know the Rolling Dice Taking Names guys. I know I played with Marty on over Skype once. So it's a pretty fun little game.
Yeah, I dig it. It's a good one.
Nice. I didn't know you're super into, like, miniatures and painting as well. How did that sort of thing start?
Well, that's also, you know how I was talking earlier about how we never played board games when I was a kid. My family never really did that. So it was a friend, Steve, that got me into hobby gaming with Dungeons and Dragons. Well, the miniatures gaming I got into that because of my father.
Oh, gotcha.
And that is... And he didn't play miniatures games. I'm not saying that.
Gotcha.
He was a model railroad enthusiast.
Oh, nice.
So when I grew up, it was like, you know, 4 nights out of the week, I was in the basement shop with my dad working on model trains. We were building little buildings. We were painting things. We were little people and setting up little scenes with trees and all this different stuff. And he was way into that when he was a kid. He built model cars, built model engines, all kinds of stuff when he was a kid. And this was our hobby all throughout the 80s, right, when I was growing up. And, you know, I learned how to do that kind of thing. And then, you know, I got out of it for a while because, you know, I left home and, you know, I wasn't doing model railroading on my own. And somewhere along the line, I got the bug to sort of do that again. And I bought Warhammer. Like, I bought one of the starter boxes, Battle for Skull Pass, whenever that one came out years ago. And I started putting that together. And I got those same vibes that I got when I was working on the railroad stuff with my father. And I started building, you know, little scenes with trees and stuff that we could fight around and stuff. And then it was just boom, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars later. And to this day, like, I love miniatures gaming. Age of Sigmar, Warcry, the new small model count one that came out a couple of years ago. That's my favorite miniatures game I've ever played. I love that game. It's so easy to get into and has such a beautiful game system. The dice mechanics are great, and it's fun to put together a little war bands for it. And they're not, I mean, they are expensive because it's Games Workshop and they put out good stuff, like good high quality stuff. So you're gonna pay for it. But it's a lot easier than putting together an army with 150 miniatures. You're putting together, 8 guys, and it works out really well.
I've been really thinking about making a Night Haunt war cry war band or whatever. I don't have the cards for it yet, but I have the Soul Wars box. I've been painting up some ghosts and stuff like that and being like, oh man, I should figure out this game, but I don't have anybody to actually play it with. So, it's always sometimes hard to find the right group.
That is my problem too. I have people that want to play, but it's like you were talking about with D&D. War games are very hard for me to put together because I have the D&D day, and some of the guys that play D&D with me, they also want to play war games, but we don't have enough days in the week.
Exactly.
So we play them, but just not as often. We don't have a regular day, and I would love to get back that regular day of, we used to do it every Wednesday night. We would go in my basement. I used to have a house, in town. And the basement was one of those dungeonous basements, those dirt wall basements, right? And I had this big layout down there, and we would go down literally into a dungeon, and we would play Warhammer Fantasy Battles on that table every Wednesday night. And man, I love those days. I wish that we could have those back, but at this point, I think my wife would probably kill me if I did. Because I got board game night at another board game night, then a D&D night, then a podcast day, and then another podcast day, and she's like, you do too much.
I think the interesting part about Warhammer is the whole hobby aspect of it, like painting up the miniatures and building terrain and list building and trying to figure out all that stuff, or just researching more about the game. I think that part is very interesting because I feel like the ratio of hobby to actual gameplay is huge. You spend so much time painting your army and doing all these different things, and some people that's the entire enjoyment they get out of the game.
Well, I would say it's 80% of the fun for me, at least. I enjoy painting miniatures. I enjoy assembling miniatures. I enjoy putting together terrain for these games. And there are miniatures games that I own that I have not played yet, but I've painted all the miniatures just because I wanted to. I've bought miniatures for Warhammer that I don't own that army. I just like that model, and I'm going to get that and paint it. Because that's part of the fun. And it's Magic the Gathering has the same concept as these war games, in that the game isn't only you across the table from another person. The game starts way before that and after that. You're picking your army. You're devising a strategy, so you're list building at that point. You're picking the right units to put into that army, and then you get those things, and then you assemble them, then you paint them, and you pick your color scheme, and if you get into it to the level that we have in the past, and I do now with Warcry, I'm naming specific characters and giving them paint schemes and sort of backstory in my own mind. I don't sit down and write a book about all the different characters, but in my own mind I sort of have the personality of this character. And when I go into the game, I've already put in way more time than I'll ever play this game, just preparing for the game. There's a game outside of the game there, and it's all about preparing for the battle, then going into the battle, and then after you go out of the battle, many times we used to play War Machine. I only had one other friend that would play War Machine, so it was 2 of us, and we both played. We got our armies, we played, and one of us would win. And then we would go home thinking, the loser would go home thinking, all right, now how do I win against him?
Yeah.
And we would buy another model. We were like, okay, I need that model to counter what he did in that game. And then we'd add it. And it was this evolving process of, of course it was a lot of money that we were spending, but still it was this evolving process of the game never ended. It was just this constant game of one battle after the next and improving our list so that we could fight back. And then if we would start doing better than the other guy started doing it. All right, I'm going to start adding to my list to fight back against that. Boy, it's a really fulfilling experience if you can put the time into it. And I always call those lifestyle games, right? You have to live the lifestyle of this game to really get the full extent out of it. But I mean, if you just like the miniatures and want to buy the miniatures and paint them and then put them on your shelf, that's good enough, because I've done that too.
What are the specific factions that are like your favorite? Because I know there's all sorts of different factions in many of these miniatures games. Like, what's your favorite? Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40k? Like, what's your go-to factions for those?
Well, okay. So in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, in the old world, the dwarves were my favorite. I was a dwarf player, straight up. That's my favorite race ever, and everything dwarf. It's funny because I've never
transfer over to Age of Sigmar.
In Age of Sigmar, I don't like the dwarves as much because they didn't. I mean, now recently they've brought back sort of the Warhammer Fantasy dwarves as the free peoples. There are they brought those models in, but the major factions of the dwarves aren't the same anymore, and I don't like them as much.
Gotcha.
So when it comes to Age of Sigmar, my favorite armies, it's a good question. I like the Nighthaunts a lot. I have a Warcry warband for them. I have a goblin. I have a lot of them. So Age of Sigmar, I'm not sure what my favorites. I can't answer the question because I have a lot of different ones and I like them all for different reasons. Warhammer 40k, Blood Angels. I'm a Blood Angels player. I love the Blood Angels. I love the story of their chapter. I love the paint scheme. I love the just the history of that whole thing. I dig it. That's my faction right there. Are there any others?
For me, I always like the undead stuff. So, like, I always played Necrons in 40k, and that's why I'm messing with the Nighthaunts now. I mean, I know they're not necessarily skeletons or more ghosts, but for some reason, I always like those undead, creepy-looking factions.
Yeah. The Necrons are great. I also have a Necrons army for Warhammer 40,000 because I really like them. My only problem with the Necrons is they're always so... They don't have enough options. When the Warhammer 40,000 version of Warcry is Kill Team. And, I was putting together kill teams as well because I love 40k too. And the first one I put together was Necrons. And I was like, man, they don't have any options. It's just like they have like 4 guys and this is what you can have. And look at the space marine. They got like 50,000 things you can do. I'm so irritated by that all the time. I love that faction, but I wish they had more options.
For sure.
With the kill team, one of my favorite factions I put together were the Rogue Traders. That one was a box set that they put out, and I was like, man, I gotta have that because Rogue Traders are cool. They don't have any. There's not an equivalent faction in 40k for them. They're just like the pirates in Warhammer 40,000 World, and they put out this kill team for them. And I bought that one and put that together and painted it up, and I love that one. And also Necromunda. I love Necromunda too.
That's like the cyberpunky version, right?
Yep. That's it's not the war level. It's just street gangs fighting, and they have some really cool factions for that one too. So I dig that. I don't play that one as much, but I enjoy the models of those more than actually playing. Kill Team is, I think, a better game. Similar game, but a better game, I think.
If somebody was interested in getting to like the hobby aspect, whether it be like painting their board game miniatures or looking at like playing a miniatures game, is there any like suggestions of like where to start for that sort of thing?
Where to start if you want to get into miniatures games? Okay.
Or just like the painting of stuff, or like the hobby aspect of it. Like, hey, I want to paint up a board game, or hey, I want to paint up this thing or that thing.
The easiest thing to do is Reaper has these awesome kits. That are like little suitcase like things. You open them up and they have paint inside, they have a paintbrush inside, and they have a couple of miniatures in there. They're Reaper Bones miniatures, the real junky cheap Reaper Bones miniatures, and they have all the colors that you need to paint those miniatures right there. You get this little box set, and it I think it has like a tutorial in there, like it kind of teaches you a little bit about how to do it. And what's great about that is it is not that expensive, and the Reaper Bones miniatures are junk. So like if you mess them up, you don't care, you just throw it out, and you could go to the store and buy another one for $2 and try again. That's great. That's the best way to start. Here's another way, actually. Just this past week, a buddy of mine, for the past few months, has been collecting Marvel Crisis Protocol. Now, he's not a miniatures game player. He plays board games with us on every Wednesday, but he's not a miniatures game player, but he's way into Marvel. So he's like, I'm going to start collecting this. So he bought all the miniatures. He's assembling all the miniatures, but he's never painted anything in his whole life. Just this past week, our local game store had a Learn to Paint night.
Oh,
and
that's
that
awesome.
was the greatest thing that they did, man, because he went there and they gave him like a Reaper Bones type. Actually, what they did was they gave those WizKids models. They're pre-primed.
Like all the D&D stuff?
Yeah. And so they're pre-primed miniatures, so you could just sit down and start painting on them. You don't have to like do any of the priming and stuff. And they went through and helped you paint these models. They had all the paints and the brushes and stuff there for you. What a great way to start, because you're not invested, right? That's the problem with miniatures. You know, he bought all of this Marvel Crisis Protocol. He don't want to mess it up. He spent all his money on these miniatures. I don't want to paint this stuff because I'm going to mess it up. I don't know how. So going to those nights like that, or getting the Reaper Bones and just trying on those, because you have no investment. You're like $2 in. I don't care about this skeleton. If I ruin him, I'll throw him away. You know, that I think is the first thing to think about. And here's another way to get into miniatures games and the hobby aspect is a game that I love, Gaslands. Gaslands is an awesome game because the miniatures you can't get cheaper, that you play with Hot Wheels or Matchbox cars. And I mean, if you want to get
supposed to make them look beat up.
Sure, yeah, exactly. You paint those things. Oh, you spent 80 cents on this thing. Like, if you mess it up, just go out and buy the same one again and try again, you know? So what a neat way to sort of learn how to do all of those hobby techniques. Like, check out some YouTube channels and learn how to, like, you know, paint rust and put dents in something and bullet holes in things and glue a couple of, you know, I don't know, like guns to it from some other thing, some other model you bought at one point. Those are, I think, great ways to get into the hobby aspects of miniatures games.
Oh, for sure. There's like massive amounts of like tutorial videos on YouTube. Like, it's insane the amount of painting tutorial videos. I used to like, I really like doing basing on miniatures. It's really cool to like come up with all sorts of different aspects. So I just go through and watched like tons of videos of like all sorts of different bases and get ideas of seeing how people are doing. It's like, oh, cool, this dude's like using baking soda to make a snow base. That's kind of cool. Like, oh, interesting. You know, it's interesting to see lots of other people's ideas on stuff and then trying to figure out ways to make it your own.
I love it. It's such a great hobby. You know, as much as I love D&D and I love board games, miniatures are actually... The reason I love them so much is because they're my solitude hobby. You know, like sometimes when you don't have friends to come over that night, or if you just feel like, you know what, I'm going to be alone tonight, I'm going to push all of the world out of my head and leave all of my problems behind, and I'm going to sit right here at my painting station behind me, turn on the lights, and I'm just going to paint. And I've been doing that for the past, I don't know, about a month. I decided I'm going to paint all of my Arcadia Quest miniatures.
That's
so
crazy.
I'm working on it. I'm about 2/3 of the way through the heroes, not the monsters. I might never get to all the monsters, but I'm going to paint all the heroes for sure. And I'm telling you, it's such a stress relief and such a relaxing hobby to just sit down, you know, maybe throw on some music or maybe throw on a movie on the iPad.
Throw on a Secret Cabal podcast or the Dice Tower or whatever, you know.
Absolutely. And just sit there and paint. And it's like your mind like just focuses in on that and nothing else. And you come out of it just feeling like you had a massage. I love it.
Yeah, I definitely like the aspect of like taking these models that tons of people have painted, and there's all sorts of different ways, but then you get to pick the color scheme and you kind of get to make it your own, you know. It's like I've never been like, oh, that's the way the faction's supposed to look, but I kind of want to make it look this color instead because it's cool to match this color with that color, and it's definitely fun. I really wish, I'm not a very fast painter at all. I wish I had more time to like actually sit and do it. I just have so many things going on, but it's really enjoyable when I get a chance to do it. I never actually finish anything, though. I have so many half-painted games. It's ridiculous.
You wouldn't believe the number of miniatures that I can see within my eyesight right now, looking out over here. Unpainted miniatures and half-painted things all over the place. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to move on to something else.
Didn't was it Games Workshop themselves I don't remember if it was Games Workshop or somebody spoofing it, had like where they're making fun of like 50 Shades of Grey or something like that, and he brought his like girlfriend into a room and it's just all gray plastic lining the walls. It's just like horror scene with horror music playing. Unpainted games, that's messed up.
Pretty much what everybody who's into miniatures game, what their life is like. But we keep buying more. Why do we keep buying more if we have all of this? Because we want to collect this miniature. We have to have it. This miniatures game. We have to have the starter set. Yeah.
I really enjoy the putting the miniatures together as well. I mean, I know some people find that like, oh man, I don't want to get a board game where I had to put the miniatures together. But I mean, Games Workshop miniatures are insane. Like they are, I mean, nobody else has as good a quality. And I mean, I would buy a board game that I had to put miniatures together if I had to. I mean, I know there are some and there have been some in the past, but there's not that many. And the quality is ridiculous when it comes to those Games Workshop things. Like, I don't know. I think it'd be cool to see more games where the miniatures are up to that quality, which you can only really do if they come like in pieces, pretty much.
Sure. And there's a lot of games that the assembly, I don't really care with a lot of games. Like I remember the original Super Dungeon Explorer, you had to assemble all the miniatures.
Oh yeah.
With that one, it was like I don't really care. Like make the poses crappier so I don't have to assemble it. I don't really want
for sure.
to. I know Shadows of Brimstone, the original set of that, you had to assemble all the miniatures, and it was a nightmare because they were terrible miniatures.
That's bad if you have to assemble them and they're also not that good sculpts.
Right, yeah. When they all got better, right? You know, Arcadia Quest later, everything was assembled for you already. With Shadows of Brimstone, their quality of miniatures got much better as the sets went on. So that's the thing that's bad. I hate putting together a crappy miniature. I mean, I'm telling you, like I get fired up when I have a garbage miniature. And you're right, absolutely right about Games Workshop. Their process of sculpting and their process of the plastics they use, they have just got it down. It is such a breeze to assemble those things. Some of them are extremely complicated too, but yet they just slip together like perfectly. And a little bit of glue, whoop, and they go together perfectly. Wow, like they really got their stuff together and know how to do it. And that's what you pay for, right? You pay for the best quality miniatures in the world. It's still a little bit too expensive, I think, even though it's the best in the world. But I still continue to buy it because, you know, I like it.
Yeah. I think it's crazy because like back in the day, when they had different management and stuff, Games Workshop was kind of like the company everyone was angry with, and they wouldn't let people do stuff. But they switched out management, and they're making all sorts of crazy good stuff and like board games. I feel like they're like a force to be reckoned with now. You know, it's like crazy how good their things are, and I think it's cool. Like the different board games. I mean, some are better than others that they're coming out with, but it's interesting to see them come out with different styles of actual board games, not just miniatures games.
Yeah, man, I'm telling you, back when we were first playing Warhammer Fantasy Battles, that was during the dark times of Games Workshop when they were not a well-liked company. They were still making plenty of money. You know, people were still buying their stuff because Warhammer 40,000 was popular. But yeah, that was when they were asking Board Game Geek to take down any scans of their rule books. I don't know why they care, but they were. And people were getting just fired up and mad about them. But you're absolutely right. Like they had the CEO shift, and when that new CEO came in there, it was like night and day. And I remember back when we were playing, when we stopped playing Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and we switched over to Privateer Press. It was really early on in Privateer Press's run when they started out, and they had War Machine. War Machine was one of the best miniatures games I ever played back then. You know, I think it was Mark II rule set, which is absolutely beautiful. 1 and 2. I loved that game. And they were killing Games Workshop. You know, if you look at those, the best-selling miniatures games of the quarter, you know, War Machine was at the top, and Games Workshop was starting to fall down. And I'm telling you, like, that new CEO made the huge switch. Games Workshop right back at the top again, and Privateer Press isn't even on that list anymore.
And now they come out with new models, and you're like, what is that? You know?
Yeah, right? And I'm telling you, though, I think Privateer Press is trying to get the stuff together now because they got that new game coming out called Warcaster, which is their science fiction version of War Machine, which I always wondered why they didn't do that. And now they just announced it, I don't know, the past couple of weeks, and their first sets are coming to Kickstarter, probably as just a pre-order system using Kickstarter. And it looks pretty cool. Like
that's awesome.
Looked like I'm hoping that they come back, because I remember when War Machine put out that Mark III rule set, and boy, everybody it was an exodus. We were like, this game ain't good anymore. We're out. Boom. Yeah, I'm hoping that they come back around again because they were a cool company back in the day.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we're basically at kind of like 1 hour, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap this thing up. But yeah, if people don't know where to find your content or would like to learn more about that, where can they find more about the Secret Cabal and what you do?
Well, easy enough. You can go to thesecretcabal.com. You can find our podcast there. You can find links to all our good stuff. We have a Board Game Geek Guild, which is linked off of our website. Of course, you can find our podcast at iTunes. Stitcher has it as well. Yeah, we are on Facebook and Twitter as well at The Secret Cabal.
Nice. Well, it's definitely been a blast having you on, Jamie. So it was great. I know it's short, but it's cool to have you on the show. And I've been a fan of the Secret Cabal for a long time, so it's cool to get to talk to you for a little bit.
Well, thank you so much. I was having a blast here today, just talking about games. This is one of my favorite things to do, man. And we just sat for an hour and talked about all different kinds of games. So I really appreciate you having me on today. It was awesome.
Awesome. Well, make sure to check out the Secret Cabal, and thanks everybody for checking out Spaces Between. This is on iTunes. If you search for Spaces Between. Also, this goes up on the Dice Tower channel Monday nights at 5 p.m. on our YouTube channel there. So make sure to check it out and check out all of our other episodes with awesome guests as well. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Thanks so much for watching another Dice Tower video. If you enjoy our videos, subscribe to the channel for more fun, comprehensive board game coverage. Also, consider joining us at one of our events. Come to Dice Tower Retreat, a small, intimate gathering where gaming is king. Join us for Dice Tower Cruise, the largest board game cruise. Attend Dice Tower West in Las Vegas for gaming fun on the West Coast, or Dice Tower East in Orlando in sunny Florida. Dice Tower Conventions, the friendliest gaming conventions on Earth. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.